Here in Georgia, as in the whole of the Soviet Union, we have lived without God for over 70 years. Churches were closed, and it was even dangerous to admit to being a believer.
Georgians belonged to one of the oldest nations in Christendom. According to legend, Elijah's cloak was kept in Georgia, left here by Jews who were hiding from persecutions meted out by Nebuchadnezzar. The beginnings of Christianity in Georgia go back to the 1st century, when the first apostles arrived here and set up Christian communities. According to tradition passed down through the ages by word of mouth, the first leaders included the apostle Andrew, as well as Bartholomew and Matthew. A legend holds that the Virgin Mary was assigned to proclaim the good news in Georgia.
According to legend, Mary was present when the apostles got together to decide who was to go to which country to proclaim the gospel, and Georgia fell to her. However, Our Lady was taken up to heaven and thus was unable to go there, and so the apostles went instead. That is why there is such a strong cult of Our Lady in Georgia. When someone asks whether I am a missionary in Georgia, I sometimes mischievously answer that I am not a missionary, because Georgia, after all, has been a Christian country for over 1600 years.
Georgia became a Christian country thanks to Saint Nino and the king and queen, Saints Miriam and Nana. They were all active in Kartli, today's Georgia, at the turn of the 3rd and 4th centuries. During her stay in Jerusalem, Nino had a vision in which she saw Our Lady sending her to preach the gospel in the Caucasus. She ended up as a slave at the court of King Miriam of Kartli, which is where she is claimed to have miraculously cured the king's seriously ill wife, Nana. In recognition of this achievement, the king duly converted to Christianity.
When Nino arrived in Georgia, she took 2 grapevine twigs, which she intertwined into her hair and arranged in the shape of a cross, the basis of the famous St. Nino cross, which also happens to be very similar to the Holy Cross that was used by Pope John Paul II. Legends as well as oral tradition attribute many miracles and healings to her, which in turn led to a powerful and swift conversion of the Georgian nation, as well as the firm establishment of Christianity in Georgia.
The Greeks were the first Christian communities in the 2nd century and the first Christians in Georgia. In the 5th century, the Iberian Church was granted autocephalous status and its own patriarch. The Church became divided following the conquest of Georgia by Byzantium and Islam, but then united following the reunification of the country in the 11th century. The situation became more complicated in the 15th century when both Turkey and Persia successively attacked Georgia, both bent on the Islamization of the region. The situation remained unchanged up until the 19th century and the rule of the Tsars, when, though allowed the building of churches, Catholics were still unable to enjoy full freedom of belief.
Georgia was annexed by Russia in the 19th century. The plight of Catholics in the 19th century was intriguing because of the country's noticeable cultural development. For example, 19th century Catholicism left Georgia with a great cultural legacy. We have many great Catholic innovators, both in the arts and sciences, as well as music.
Though Georgian independence came with the fall of Tsarist Russia, it lasted only briefly from 1918 to 1921. Independence ended when the Red Army invaded the country in 1921, unleashed a bloody terror and incorporated Georgia into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. The Church suffered immense losses at the time in human terms, through imprisonment, deportations and executions, as well as materially, following the confiscation, destruction and blowing up of church property. The church practice, in effect, became impossible. Communist rule held sway in the Soviet republics, including Georgia, right up to the early 90s. The Soviet system, not unlike all other totalitarian systems, sought to vindicate the failure of its economic and social policies by apportioning blame to an internal as well as external threat. The Catholic Church proved eminently suitable for this purpose, regarded by the communist system as enemy number one.
We were brought up in communist times to be atheists. Teachers said that there was no God. They taught us that only power and natural law existed, subject to scientific study in order to determine the basis and framework of life. I was born in 1965, at a time that can be described as entrenched communism, when all churches were firmly closed. I can remember how we liked to play, here, in the vicinity of this church. We were always very glad when they opened it. During the year, the communists would come a couple of times and bring grain and other items to store here. The church was used as a warehouse. We could then go inside and play. Entry was forbidden, so people who wanted to pray would gather in a building that stood next to the church, called the priest's house. Everything was arranged as inside a church, except that there was no priest. There was a hall where people gathered throughout communist times. On Sunday, grandmothers would come with small children. They weren't allowed to bring older school children. They primarily recited the rosary.
We came here to the church and prayed in front of the church door. We never denied our faith. We came, prayed, and sang. The agricultural cooperative stored wheat in this church. I also brought the wheat here myself, as I worked there at the time. They later stored corn. The church slowly fell into disrepair, and then the floor began to rot.
My parents worked in a school. They couldn't talk freely about their faith. I remember when we used to drive from Valẽ into town. We used to pass a beautiful church on the way. We used to go inside and pray, light a candle, and then drive on. Nobody could learn about this, because you could be thrown out of work. I don't remember the event, but my parents recounted how they took me to Tbilisi in secret and had me baptized in a Catholic church. I knew I was a Catholic from that moment.
Catholics, having suffered greatly under communist rule, now number only about 50,000. In Tbilisi, throughout the communist period, Catholics had only one church, St. Peter and Paul's Church. This church, for lack of Georgian priests, was managed by one single Polish priest, who suffered persecutions for his devotion to the faith.
I wasn't allowed to teach the catechism in church. They used to say, "The Orthodox don't teach, so neither will you." I didn't listen to them. Came in one year, went out the next. I did what I had to do, and that was that. When I mentioned this to the bishop, he advised, "If people come, teach them to the best of your ability. Teach the catechism and dispense the sacraments. Do everything to the best of your ability." Father Jan Śnieżyński and two Eucharistic nuns stayed together here for 25 hard years, during Brezhnev's, Chernenko's and whoever else's time, Andropov's. And thanks to these people, beaten and persecuted, this church and community survived. I remember how Father Jan recounted how he was beaten during the night interrogations. People such as Father Śnieżyński should become cardinals. It's thanks to such people that nobody remembers or talks about that the church has survived here. These people gave their lives for this church, on this land, in this place, in this country.
In 1991, a newly independent Georgia emerged, battered from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Once an affluent part of the USSR, the deteriorating relations between Georgia and Russia soon resulted in the disintegration of the Georgian economy. Healthcare in Georgia, once the envy of the Soviet Union, collapsed. Georgians, once used to inexpensive energy from the USSR, were confronted with rampant prices and energy cuts. Manufacturing, dependent on the near-exclusive trade with the USSR, crumbled with an explosion in unemployment and profound poverty. This economic collapse was mirrored by a moral collapse.
There was no private property here for 70 years. There was practically no church for 70 years. People weren't taught religion or the commandments or about spiritual fundamentals or moral ones. Nobody taught us. For who was to do it? Great confusion reigned in people's consciences between what is just, morally acceptable, and what is socially admissible. To create a real evangelical consciousness became a real problem. To the problem of people's ability to distinguish right from wrong, one must also add man's sinful nature. A relativization of the human person came about. There are cultures that not so much viewed the individual, but rather the family or group as the foundation of society structure. All this had disappeared and the human person became something relative.
Una realtà molto relativa.
I very often talk with all sorts of acquaintances and friends. They tell me that not everything in communism was bad. For example, healthcare had value and was available to everyone. The state, the system guaranteed it. However, that system, the Soviet communist one that we are talking about, erased certain human values. They were somehow lost, mislaid. These general problems are relics of 70 years of communism, of a life without God, of this Homo Sovieticus, who said one thing, thought another, then did something completely different. That mentality somehow survives, and indeed life continues without any reference to either conscience or faith. all this continues to this day. It's firstly the fault of a lack of ideology, and then of a communist ideology that replaced religion.